This is the Constructionist Podcast, where we take ancient stories, the person of Jesus, current events and topics, and help you construct a new Christian worldview that's relevant and loving to those around you. I'm your host, Kevin Bates. I'm a semiotician and community builder looking at the signs of the times to build a better future together. Welcome to the Constructionist Podcast. In tonight's episode, we are discussing the life of Christ through the book of Mark, a historical and semiotic perspective. So as hosts of this podcast, we strive to provide you with relevant and a compassionate worldview framework that'll help guide you through life. And we believe that in order to achieve this, it's important to get our own house in order, looking at our own spirituality, our own relationships, our own approach of how we show up in the world. So this means that learning to love and care for ourselves in different ways is essential before we can fully love and care for others in a way that we were meant to do and to be. We encourage a worldview that's built on the principles of Christ, yes, and in this episode, we're going to examine the life of Christ through a clear and honest lens. So by doing so, we hope to offer insights and perspectives that will help you in your own journey towards a greater understanding of love and compassion for yourself and others. So there's a couple of things that we're going to assure you in tonight's episode. We are not going to be fabricating anything. And many have done this. Many have taken the Gospels in the Bible and what we would consider divine or sacred literature, and they've literally been misinformed or fabricated ideas that would support their own confessions. So we're not in the market to do that. We don't desire to make anything up, and we're going to provide an honest and authentic perspective on our examination of this book. So in previous episodes, we've discussed the potential pitfalls of just simply deconstructing. We need to be able to construct as we deconstruct, moving towards a new understanding as we begin to move away from our misunderstanding. So it's important to avoid getting stuck in a cycle of perpetuating the same patterns of behavior that we sought to change in the first place. So instead, we need fresh perspective. We need a new framework to construct healthy habits and behaviors and new spirituality. So that's why the Constructionist Podcast is a space for exploring new ideas, presenting practical thoughts, presenting new theologies for our daily life in a new way. And we aim to provide a platform for honest and authentic discussions on relevant topics. So the three of us don't necessarily agree on everything. And so we have open discussions where you might even hear a disagreement between the three of us, that one might agree with one thing and the other might subscribe to another. And that's why, as listeners, we just desire to do this live in a purposeful and meaningful way so that you can get an inside look on what it's like to do theology, what it's like to do spirituality. And so in tonight's episode, we're excited to share our best attempt at exploring practical ways to apply these ideas and theologies to our daily life. So we're going to look at the life of Christ through the book of Mark. We do have those scriptures that are going to be presented to you on the screen, so you don't need any books. You don't need maybe a pen and a paper if you wanted to take some notes. That would be helpful. And we also want you to interact with us. So submitting a question, submitting a thought is always welcome. So if you enjoy the podcast, we desire for you to engage with us. We believe that through interaction and discussion with listeners like you, we can continue to learn ourselves and grow together. So we value your feedback. We value your questions, your ideas, and we're excited to build a community around a shared exploration, what we call a communal hermeneutic of perspective. So don't hesitate to reach out. We do take those privately. You can submit them on our DMs, and then we can take those and then vet through those, and then answer those questions in real time. Or through the week, you can also throw some questions up, and we will be happy to respond to you when you do so in a respectable amount of time. So if you enjoy the Constructionist podcast and want to support us financially, please follow the link in the chat or show notes on the social media platform you're listening to. Visit our Give page, and your support will enable us to continue producing high quality content like this. All right, my guests tonight, Sharia, Master's in Theology. Jake, Master's in Theology. I have my doctorate in semiotics and leadership and theology. So what is really interesting about this topic, through an honest level discussion, the book of Mark, as far as we get tonight, I hope it's far. Other topics we haven't necessarily been experts on. We've just had musing conversations, noodling around topics and such. But tonight's book, the book of Mark, and tonight's topic, we think that we are a little bit more learned, a little bit more educated. We're able to do a little bit more with the material, and we hope that it is enjoyable for you. So good evening, Shreya and Jake. How are you?
Hey.
Jake, are you there?
I am. It's a little bit lagging behind on my end, but I am here.
Very good. All right. So let's start reading. We're actually going to skip forward to Mark chapter 8, starting in verse 1. I'm going to read. Last week we talked about the feeding of the 5,000. And this week we wanted to couple that with the feeding of the 4,000. The feeding of the 4,000 seems like an extra story, seems like an extra feeding. It is. It does have a different metaphor. It does have a different, I guess, message to it. And so let's pop up the feeding of the 5,000, the very last few scriptures of the feeding of the 5,000 in Mark 6. Isn't it 6 or 5?
He may not have those, Kevin. So why don't you just go ahead
I'm
and
sorry.
read.
Yeah, I'm going to go ahead and read those out of my Bible here, and just give me a second to look it up.
I have it right here if you want me to.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, go ahead and read about the 12 baskets for me.
There it is. He directed the disciples to seat all the people in groups as they are having a banquet on the green grass. They sat down in groups of hundreds and fifties. He took the 5 loaves and 2 fishes, broke the bread to heaven. Later on, everyone ate until they were full. They filled 12 baskets with leftover pieces of bread and fish. About 5,000 had eaten.
Jake, we lost your voice. Are you still there with us?
Yes. Okay.
Not sure what's going on with our lagging tonight. That's unfortunate, but hopefully we can get to the bottom of that. So what I want then is to pull up Mark chapter 8 now, starting in verse 1, and we're going to go through the feeding now of the 4,000. Definitely related and similar, but we want to talk through these two stories just kind of simultaneously and look at the differences, especially these baskets and the represent or the metaphor that we see. So in Mark chapter 8, verse 1, it says, "In those days, there was another large crowd with nothing to eat. Jesus called his disciples and told them, 'I feel sorry for the crowd because they have been with me for 3 days and have nothing to eat. If I send them away hungry to their homes, they won't have enough strength to travel, for some have come a long distance.' His disciples responded, 'How can anyone get enough food in this wilderness to satisfy these people?' Jesus asked, 'How much bread do you have?' They said, 7 loaves. He told the crowd to sit on the ground. He took the 7 loaves, gave thanks, broke them apart, and gave them to his disciples to distribute. And they gave the bread to the crowd. They also had a few fish. He said a blessing over them, then gave them to the disciples to hand out also. They ate until they were full. They collected 7 baskets full of leftovers. This was a crowd of about 4,000 people. Jesus then sent them away, and they got in the boat and went to a different region. So this is a very important scripture because it's been debated, is this scripture the same as the feeding of the 5,000? It sounds similar. Is this just a repeat addition? We left off 1,000 people, so it's a perfect rounded number. It doesn't matter anyway. There's been a lot of thoughts around these scriptures. And remember something very important. The book of Mark, I believe, is a retelling or a signaling of the Exodus. So you have this new crowd, this new audience that is listening or receiving this material, and to signal different important thoughts, ideas, even though it's given to mostly a Gentile crowd, it is very still Jewish in its presentation, Jewish in its numbering, and also in its story, because the thought is that the Jewish faith is the foundation, or Christianity comes from those thoughts. And so you can never get away from Jewish tradition when it comes to Christianity. It was said to be fulfilled, like the law and the prophets were fulfilled, but you can't get away from it and shouldn't get away from it. You shouldn't deny it. It's there. So when you read the feeding of the 4,000, there's some signaling, really important signaling that I see, and we can debate about it and think about it. The first is the number 3. In Hebrew, and in Hebrew culture, 3, 7, 12, 40, 1,000, these numbers, I'm not talking about numerology and trying to look for the end of time and all that kind of stuff by calculating numbers. What I'm talking about is just the signaling of perfection and creation and fulfillment and wholeness. And so Hebrew writers or the Hebrew culture would use different signaling, like the fig tree or the almond tree, or water, like every time you see water, there's some form of salvation going on. The deep, the darkness of the deep of the water, there's some kind of evil going on. So these metaphors, these pictures in the Hebrew language, actually, if you understand the context and understand the bigger semiotic meaning, to bring meaning to it, there's very rich things here. So they were with Jesus for 3 days. It's not just this random number. Was it 3.5? Was it 4? There is a perfect amount of time that these, if you throw that up there, Rob, again, you can see this number that they spent this time with Jesus. Jesus called his disciples. I feel sorry for the crowd because they've been with me for 3 days with nothing to eat. So they've listened to this 3 days. He gives them bread, he gives them fish, and they collect it in 7 baskets full of leftovers. So Jake, take it from here. Take us back to the manna scene, the Moses scene. Take us back to that scene and kind of explicate that for us.
Am I lagging right now, or am I good?
You're good. It seems like you're good.
Okay. Well, I'll ask Rob to throw out that image one more time again. I promise you. If you look at what his disciples ask him, how can we get enough food in the wilderness to satisfy these people? You can take it down now, Rob. When you read the Exodus narrative, and Israelites, or the Hebrew people, cross the Red Sea into the desert, into the wilderness, they're posing the same question to Moses. And what happens then is the manna story. The bread comes down from heaven every morning like dew on the grass, and the word manna means, what is it? We don't know. And then also in the evening time, quail would come out, and they would capture the quail, and they never took more than they had need. And so they had to take the exact amount that they needed. Nothing could be left or it would rot. And so they were very purposeful in what they took, and it was never out of scarcity or out of surplus. It was just out of what they had need to do, or scarcity to gain surplus. If you look at the story, it matches it fairly well. Jesus crosses over the ocean earlier, is in this land, is in with the people for a certain amount of days, and then a miracle happens to feed the entire 4,000 people. Um, yeah, I think it's still a story of hospitality, of opening each other up. That those who had surplus only took what they needed, and then passed around what they didn't. So much so that in the end, was seven baskets were filled. The first time it was 12, and this time it was 7.
So that idea of 7 baskets is what's the scripture there? Back in the wilderness, they collected these 7 baskets as well. So it's like a fulfillment of well, like for example, there's fulfillment that you see between the Old Testament and the New Testament, like the second Pentecost. So the first Pentecost is right at Moses in the cleft of the rock. That God
Mount Sinai.
passes by, that
Yeah.
God passes by Moses, and then when he comes down from that mountain, he sees that there's this golden calf, and give me the number 3,000. Yeah, 3,000 are killed that day. So there's a slaughtering of 3,000 people, and then is it 3,000? I'm losing my number there. What is it?
I'm not sure. I don't know right now.
Well, then
It's a
Acts
certain.
2,
It's the same number.
yeah, 3,000 were saved that day. I think it's 3,000. Yeah, I'd have to look it up really quick. I'm just speaking off the top of my head. Sorry. So then in Acts 2, you see the same number when Peter at the day of Pentecost is speaking and the Holy Spirit is upon them, that the same number is saved that day that was killed that day. So you see then in the manna in the Old Testament, they collected these 7 baskets, meaning that this 7 days of creation, total fulfillment, total wholeness is fed or is provided for, that we see the whole group is provided for. In the feeding of the 5,000, if I use my semiotic tools and I look at the feeding of the 5,000, you have 12 baskets. Now the 12 that we know are the 12 tribes of Israel, like Jake was alluding to. So we have this 12 tribes of Israel. So the provision is for the 12 tribes, but 7 means the complete of creation. And so now we have 7 baskets, meaning the provision is for everyone. So not just we have the 12 tribes, now we have the 7 baskets. 7 is for everyone. So this next feeding shows that the gospel, the good news, Jesus and God's presence is not just for this select group, it's for the masses, it's for the people, it's for all of creation. And so you can actually just jump right into universalism at that point. But honestly, you look at just that's low hanging fruit when it comes to numbers and comparing numbers back and forth, where you look at Old Testament concepts and New Testament concepts. You go, well, they're saying the same thing. We have bread, we have manna, we have baskets filled. These
Yeah.
are metaphors and signaling and pictures and illustrations to signal the people, like, this is a fulfillment, this is a bigger thing than just, and these stories have always been a bigger thing than just fish and bread. So
Oh, yes. I mean, we
always,
we we reduce it to fish, bread, and miracle when really there has to be multiple different types of reading, and it's not wrong to say it's fish, bread, and
right,
miracle.
sure,
There just is more to the story than what's just at first glance.
yeah,
I think it's called God of the Gaps.
oh
So
yeah, okay, yeah,
the idea is that when we in our scientific method answer a question that we've always had, we have replaced God. So like evolution creates traded God out there, and then so we have removed God from that seat.
right,
Other gods, the gaps are like, how did creation even start? Big Bang Theory or
mm-hmm,
other
right,
ideas on there, panspermia. Um, Things that we don't understand and can't understand, we put God there instead of just sitting in wonder. We have to put God there. And so we say miracle immediately in this because we don't want to look any deeper. We don't want to like see how does this match up to ancient text? How does this match up to how would an ancient reader read this?
Right. Right.
I don't think that they would jump straight to miracle. They would jump straight to a story that they have heard every single year of their life around the same time.
And even if you were a Gentile, you would rub shoulders. And if you were in a Christian community that was predominantly Gentile, you definitely would have at least heard it or been around it at some point.
And the more we put God in those gaps of what we don't understand, it has to be a God thing, the more we'll be let down and the more we have to defend God's position instead of and putting God somewhere that God never intended to be at.
Right. Some things are just plain, but very few things are plain when it comes to scripture. I saw this meme the other day that the Bible is clear, and you got this like Anglican priest with all these books behind him. So, if you just look at my my office here, you can see the Bible is clear. Really? Okay. So so then why do I have all these books behind me? It's kind of like I don't want to reduce. I mean, since Jerry Springer just passed away, we pay homage to him. But that was a very difficult show to figure out. You had to look at the nuance, like the extreme behavior that Jerry Springer brought on his show obviously meant something deeper than that was going on in the show, because so many people connected to it and watched it, maybe just for entertainment, violence and entertainment. I have no idea, but people were connecting to it, and so I don't want to reduce the Bible down to the Jerry Springer show and trying to understand the Jerry Springer show. But honestly, that's a little bit like, okay, we have these stories and there's some violence and there's some life and there's some crying and there's some beauty and there's some big bangs and there's some creation, and then you got a temple, and then you have a crucifixion, and you have some whipping, and then you have some, tomb scenes, and Mark's naked in this book at a certain point. What does that mean? And then we have the church, and then we have reprimanding the church. It just seems like can I be honest? It's like a daytime talk show. You're just like looking at this going, well, there's a lot of life going on here. And it's like, how do I understand it? I got to get into their life. Yeah. I have to figure out how to get into their life. Yeah. It's sometimes hard to do.
What's the other thing is if anyone actually read the Bible, it'd be a banned book.
Oh, yeah.
There's a lot more going on, I think, than most people.
You certainly wouldn't put it in children's hands.
Shouldn't even be in mine.
It's like,
so
wow.
the idea is there was a Catholic priest who was on a walk one day, and a boulder rolled down the hill and almost killed him.
Okay.
And there was two explanations for it. One, you had demons and gargoyles pushing the rock down, trying to crush William of Ockham. Okay. Or enough rain came that washed soil away, and the rock just rolled down the hill because of gravity, because that's what rocks do. And so Occam's razor is that the simplest answer is probably the main answer.
Right, okay.
Miracleizing everything is not the easiest answer.
Right. Right.
And so how do we look for other easier answers is important.
Mm-hmm.
Not saying that miracles can't happen, but there can be different ways this narrative makes sense.
Well, it's kind of like the prophet readings. The prophet readings you can read in 3 different ways. So when you go to Isaiah or one of the prophets, just open up the book, start reading it. You can read it in one, like with Isaiah, he's talking about Isaiah. And then the second reading could be he's talking about Jesus. And then the third reading is he's talking about the church. So you can read like Isaiah in three different lenses. Not any one of them is more correct than the other. I just think that that's the way we need to read the Bible. Yeah, this is a miraculous story, and it is a fulfillment, and it has to do with salvation. You can't negate one or the other. But your version of like the feeding of the 5,000, Jake, seems a little like this is where it's like, oh, that sounds like socialist. We can't go there. We're sharing and equality and all these things. So we can't talk about equality and sharing. It's too socialist. So we sometimes, because of our political biases, we negate certain readings. I've watched it done. It's kind of sad when like they sold their possessions and gave everything to the poor, those that were in need.
We actually changed the text to match our political ideologies. And if anyone wants to see
and
it one
also
day,
our confessions too, our confessions as well.
Our confessions changed. Our Bibles, what we have in our hands, change because of our political bent.
Right. But also our social bent too. So like if we have a confession that has a certain view of women, then Junia turns to Junius and we can't, or Junius turns back to Junia. Like we just sit there and like try to change even people's names, or like what the Pope did a lot, like 500s, Pope Gregory took all the Marys and made them all prostitutes, in scripture. So now we think all the Marys and all the women show up in like Mary Magdalene, where nowhere in scripture does it say that Mary Magdalene was a prostitute. She actually traveled around with, and my kind of quasi, not joke, but joke, not joke, is if Mary Magdalene was a prostitute, who was she prostituting with? Because she was with the disciples literally the entire time. She traveled with them more than anybody traveled with them, and spoken more than most of the apostles. So to say that Mary Magdalene was a prophet is just some made up thing. So in order to like bolster our confession or our social bends that we have, or our social angers or our social oppressions, we change the text, and we need to get back to that raw form of looking at the text, Brueggemann. It's all about the text. Look at the text. Get deep into the text. The Bible's clear, Sharia. It's clear. We have to get into that text and dig around and look at those readings. Do you have anything to say about that, Sharia? You've been musing. I feel it coming.
So when we talked about feeding the 5,000, the miracle was people sharing. And I think it's the same miracle here. But I kind of think that's the theme. So we kind of pulled this passage out of where it was placed so that we could compare those two stories side by side. But if we look at the surrounding stories a little bit before feeding the 4,000 and a little bit after feeding the 4,000, I think that same kind of theme starts to emerge, that it's about community caring for each other.
Except for Dream.
Okay, well, let's get into it. Let's go back because we got to get there.
Yeah.
We're walking on water. Let's walk on some water.
So that's 6:45.
That slide. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Would you like me to read?
Go for it.
Okay. Right then, Jesus made his disciples get into a boat and go ahead to the other side of the lake, toward Bethsaida, where he dismissed the crowd. After saying goodbye to them, Jesus went up onto a mountain to pray. Evening came, and the boat was in the middle of the lake, but he was alone on the land. He saw his disciples struggling. They were trying to row forward, but the wind was blowing against them. Very early in the morning, he came to them, walking on the lake. He intended to pass by them. When they saw him walking on the lake, they thought he was a ghost, and they screamed. Seeing him was terrifying to all of them. Just then he spoke to them. Be encouraged. It's me. Don't be afraid. He got into the boat, and the wind settled down. His disciples were so baffled they were beside themselves. That's because they hadn't understood about the loaves. In their minds had been closed so that they resisted God's ways. When Jesus and his disciples had crossed the lake, they landed at Gennesaret, anchored the boat, and came ashore. People immediately recognized Jesus and ran around that whole region, bringing sick people on their mats to wherever they heard he was. Wherever he went, villages, cities, or farming communities, they would place the sick in the marketplaces and beg him to allow them to touch even the hem of his clothing. Everyone who touched him was healed.
So throw back that, because there's some signaling in there that I want to go over. Number one, he crosses the lake again. So we're going back and forth over to these different areas. I don't think that that's necessarily by accident. The boat's in the middle of the lake. He's alone on the land. Disciples are struggling. Wind is blowing. Huh?
Can we just take a moment to laugh that, like, Jesus sees them struggling and he just lets them struggle all night?
Oh.
And then he's going to pass by them on the lake and not even get in the boat.
You know, I was reading a book this week, and the chapter was very difficult. It's called Caputo's Radical Theology, and it's pretty radical. And he talks about the Bible being about the spooky things, and I just love that there's a lot in the Bible about things that spook us, and so a lot of our spirituality is built upon spooky things, or our counter theology. So the devil's a spooky guy, lives in Middle Earth with pitchfork and horns and a red cape, where people burn alive for eternity. My gosh. Anyway, so that's like a spooky thing. So of course that has to have a counter narrative. So heaven becomes, I'm sitting on a cloud in a diaper playing a harp as a baby. So that's the counter, or the vice versa, narrative, that we have to have, a binary kind of existence of heaven and hell. I don't even, well, just to address that really quick, I don't even believe in that version of hell in any way. But just to bring up that's like the spooky thing. So now we're talking about spooky things, and Jesus walking on the water. There's a couple of spooky things. He's the spooker. I love that. Jesus is the spooky thing. Go ahead and throw that scripture up there again.
Right. They were all
Seeing
terrified.
Him was terrifying. I find that hilarious. Be encouraged. It's me. Don't be afraid. I mean, come on. If all of a sudden we were out fishing, like any of us would be, but like if we're all out there, what would we be doing in a boat? Texting and talking to our friends that aren't there? I don't know. So if we were all out on a boat and someone was walking on water, that would be spooky.
Yeah.
I mean, that would be a scary thing. So that's first, Jesus is the spooky thing, but then also, of course, we have this metaphor of the deep, what comes out of the deep. Of course, the devil's in there. I mean, when I swim in an open lake, the devil is under the water. The devil's still under the water for me. Big fish are going to eat my toes. So when you're out in the middle of the lake, and especially when you're like in the sludge, some giant crustacean type animal is going to tear off your limbs out of
a crustacean,
whatever exoskeleton animal is going to come out of the sludge slime and eat me. The spooky. So they had this like theology of the spooky things in the depth of the water. That's why Leviathan is in the water.
I had a thought about that though. So earlier on, I can't remember if it was chapter 4 or chapter 5 or chapter 6. But Jesus sends the disciples out and he gives them authority over the demons. And then we're in chapter 6, and Jesus sends his disciples off in a boat, crossing the deep where the demons live. And I kind of think maybe that's...
Whoa.
Talk about spooky things,
There you
Paisley.
go. Is it done, or should we move on?
Oh, okay.
Okay,
All right.
so
Yeah. So Chuck just said spider crabs. It's true. There's like these little. I mean, there's things that eat us. Scary things.
Another idea that we have with this is Jesus walking over chaos. And so as we talk often about water, crossing over water, going through water, how this is a retelling of creation again and again and again,
Right.
even hearkening to Exodus, which Exodus is a hearkening of creation again and again and again.
Right.
The Jesus walking on water shows the dominance over the chaos, over the deep. And so if you crack your Bible open in Genesis 1, it said the Spirit of God's hovered over the chaos, over the deep. And so I think that is mirroring that text. This passage can also be translated that Jesus was walking alongside the lake, not on the water, but next to the water. So like when I walk on the seashore or walk on the ocean, I'm walking alongside of the ocean. And Jesus is going to pass them by, but it doesn't quite make sense. People will negate it to that. You have to give a little.
So there's a thought that Jesus. What you're saying is some people don't believe Jesus was walking on water. That this is alongside. The language could say it's alongside the water.
It could be translated that Jesus was walking alongside of the lake.
Right. Okay.
Yet the story wouldn't make much sense at that point, and I think to take the miracle out of this one is not the purpose of the text.
Right.
This one's to show superiority and dominance over chaos.
Yeah, I think in our progressive looks, sometimes we try to humanize or try to make this work in our physical reality, when in actuality, it's not the purpose. You don't have to do that with these texts. That there's some greater semiotic version that can emerge out of this.
Because if you're searching for historicity or the historical narrative, Mark wasn't written, I don't think, in a linear fashion.
Oh, no.
I'm sure maybe the deaths at the end, that's easy. Births at the beginning, okay. Baptism. But anywhere in between, it doesn't matter which order it goes into. The story is more important than... It's like we talk about the life of Pi, that the story, whatever is the better story, is the one that wins.
Right. And remember, in like the first couple of episodes of Mark, we talked about it's not written in a chronological form, it's a chirological form. So you have just moments that don't have to be connected or in a chronological way. They could just be completely disconnected and just placed.
Probably thematically connected.
Yeah. Yeah, like you were saying, in chapter 8, the stories before and after, or the stories before, kind of set the stage for this theme of sharing generosity and the common theme of giving. You know what I love about this story?
What?
I want to preach this one day. When I'm really cantankerous and maybe just got a fire under my belly, fire in my belly, is get up and preach. Some crowds just need to be dismissed. That's when you were reading it, I thought, while he dismissed the crowd. I just love that wording. It actually, in the original language, he told them to go away. Some crowds just need to go away. I just love that. Not go away permanently, just take a break. right? We're going to go walk on some water for a while. Some crowds just need to be dismissed. Maybe that's me. Maybe I'm the crowd that needs to be dismissed. I don't know.
Sounds like a benediction.
Go away. Get out of here.
Some crowds just need to be dismissed. Do you think that this be encouraged, it's me, don't be afraid, do you think that connects with anything?
Not sure. I mean, I definitely could point to things, but I think it had just more to do with chaos and the calming of chaos.
I'm just doing a quick little look of fear not, don't be afraid. It's kind of take courage, it is I.
Yeah. So Paul, especially, and other writers of his time, would take snippets from the Old Testament and put them into their writings and just piecemeal things together, things that we would never be able to get by today. Like just like taking
Jesus changed the scriptures.
It breaks all the rules that they teach you in seminary.
Right.
Yes. And so like like Paul proof texts himself the entire time and out of context and
right.
So it's not so far fetched to say that Mark is doing somewhat of the same thing narratively with stories. Probably didn't have the education that Paul did to be able to quote Isaiah and actually mishmash words together to make them say what he wanted to say. It's called halakhic interpretation.
Right.
And he was, so the idea is that it's a this is that and pointing back to, but we need to understand as readers that Jesus is not mentioned in the Old Testament. The Messiah is a Messiah figure that's happened multiple times that would have other like prophecies around this person, but Jesus did not show up in the Old Testament.
Just shows up in the New Testament in spooky ways.
Spooky ways.
Spooky ways. Let's get some healing. Let's go on to Mark 6:53.
Is that me?
Sure.
It was on the slide I read.
Yeah, let's do a rereading of it and then and see where we go.
Help me out there, Shrey. It's around the end when Jesus and his disciples.
Yeah.
Mark 6:53. Oh, the numbering is not
That's
there.
it. Yeah, I'll read it.
Sorry.
When Jesus and his disciples had crossed the lake, they landed at Gennesaret, anchored the boat, and came ashore. People immediately recognized Jesus and ran around that whole region, bringing sick people on their mats to wherever they heard he was. Wherever he went, villages, cities, or farming communities, they would place the sick in the marketplaces and beg him to allow them to touch even the hem of his clothing. Everyone who touched him was healed.
So again, the fringe of his cloak, that would be the identity. They touched his identity. They touched him. Do we see anything in here besides, again, crossing over the water?
Well, this is the miracle, right?
Right. Now, to bring emphasis, though, there is something to the people going to Jesus for the miracle. I would say that sickness and disease and some of these accusations, like people were under an accusation if they were sick or had a disease. And so, like Sharia said, I don't know, maybe 3 weeks ago, Sharia, you said that when Jesus heals someone, it's not necessarily just the healing. They touched his cloak and they were healed, and the leprosy fell off of them, basically. That's what we sometimes think that the healing is for. It's a healing from our ailments because I feel sick. Yeah, there's times where I've gotten really sick. just the other week, and I'm like, okay, God, I just need to be healed. I have a lot to do, and I need to be healed. Um, but this is more, these metaphors of healing, this illustration of healing is more removing people's barriers to community and to
Mhm.
inclusion. And so a lot of the Old Testament and New Testament thinking is people with disease had sin like in their generational line, that the sins of their parents and grandparents and great grandparents and such, someone sinned in the line and they ended up sick. And so the sickness was a representation of some kind of sin. So they became untouchable. They became outside. They were put at the gates. They were removed from community. They couldn't transact in the marketplace at the same times as others. And so, or even at all. So they would end up just begging at the gates. This is more about removing barriers. And when we can help people remove barriers, we're actually exercising healing. We're actually doing that same type of healing. Any thoughts on that version or those ideas?
Yeah, that's it. Restoring people back to community.
So how do we do that
And
today? Like what's a application there?
well, I mean, this is another situation where people are bringing sick people to be healed. So there's already that relationship, that other people are bringing people to Jesus. They're supporting people in need. Um,
Jake, did you have a thought there?
Couple things. So in Numbers, you have the story of the snake lifted up, the bronze snake lifted up, and anyone who casted their vision upon the snake would be healed.
Right.
I'm trying to think of other mass healings in the Old Testament like that, and I can't think of many. But even this, like you could even look into, is this a foreshadowing of Jesus being crucified? The idea is that whoever touched, looked upon, shadow fell over, like in Peter's day, the hem of the cloak touched them,
Right.
the tassels moved over them, they would be healed if they looked upon Jesus with faith.
Right.
And so could be tied to that. I don't know. I could go with that, but why not? So the snake on a pole, not the Doctors Association. That's something out of Zeus, which is another story from another day, and why those two are so closely similar. The idea is that it's more about the position of the person, I think, and not Jesus.
Right.
And that how did the people around them break barriers? Like Jesus wasn't breaking the barriers, as we see, like people actually had to take them to him.
mm,
The people like tearing the roof off. There was some, but yeah, the tearing the roof off of the house and lowering them down so that they could be healed. The in the right place at the right time. Their friends coming, their family moving them closer. The how we do that now. We talked about this a little bit this morning in our group early, that truly there are systems in place
Yeah.
that keep the poorest of poor.
mm-hmm.
Right.
And so Brother Bruce was with us in the morning, talks about how the number one debt over all of his houseless friends is medical bills.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And medical bills can make a lien so heavy on your life that you have to pay it off before you get your license.
Your driver's
But
license, yeah.
your driver's
A
license.
lien against your driver's license, yeah.
But in order to get a job, you have to have a license.
Right.
In order to pay off your bills,
Proof of ID,
you have to have. Well, I mean, really, you need some, like, to make it easier on yourself.
Right.
You need something like that, proof of ID. So there's all these systems of the present to keep people, the poorest of poor.
Right. I
And
found that
so,
conversation interesting this morning that, you know, most of our attitude towards houseless or those that have barriers to community. Let's just call them barriers to community, just like the scene that we see in Mark 6. Um Towards the end. There's lots of people with barriers to community in let's just say our United States and the Northwest. And houselessness is a barrier to community. No matter what you think of it, no matter your judgment of it, if you can't, if you know, like have a strong opinion of it, it's a barrier to community. That person has layers of poverty stacked on them that they have to sift through or get the help to sift through or follow a system that works them through levels of poverty. That could be, something that is completely out of their control.
mm,
But because we have means, that is within our control. So he gave the example, Pastor Bruce gave us the example of working with houseless communities where medical bills are their greatest debt, which is a great barrier to community. And so somebody, has a surgery or they get something wrong and they just have to have a simple surgery because of medical insurance, the lack thereof, or low medical insurance. They go into the hospital, only a certain amount is paid for, then they're ending up with a $4,000 medical bill, which might not sound like a lot to some. It's a large amount to me, and it's an enormous amount to somebody that has layers of poverty. So how do they get $4,000 paid off? How then $1,000 is attached to their driver's license? So just to emphasize what Jake is talking about, there's layers and barriers to community using Sharea's language. And I think that in the ushering in of the year of Jubilee, how Jesus was um, ushering this in and feeling a threat, the healing on the cloak um, definitely could be just very easily tied to all debts are paid, land goes back to the original owner, there's an abundance, there's enough for everybody, and the releasing of people's barriers to salvation, to community, and to salvation both.
yeah. So like that, those elements specifically would be debt of sin specifically.
Mm-hmm.
And so
Yeah,
those debts are being paid.
right. I think we should go on to tradition.
Ooh, can I say something that I think is gonna tie in before we move
Oh,
on?
of
Yeah.
course.
As you were talking, I was thinking about how there are other barriers to community too. Like if you don't have to rely on others to get your needs met, then you're not embedded in community either. Like I was thinking about, cooking dinner and you realize you don't have something you need. And none of us really need to, go next door to borrow a cup of sugar anymore, right? Because we can just hop in our car and we can go to the store and we can get it ourselves. And we would feel silly popping in on our neighbor and asking for a cup of sugar because they also know we can go to the store and go get that. Um, so not having those relationships in place is also a barrier. And I think we see that kind of mirrored with the Pharisees, with the scribes. They were the elite of society and didn't need to depend on community in the same way.
Right.
Mm.
Mm-hmm. So two of us, a part of this group, attended the painter Scott Erickson's live performance in downtown Portland. And I can tell you that the church, because I've been a pastor of a church and several churches over the years, the church kind of is its own demon. It creates its own demons many times. And how that has happened is through judgment, where we have judged those that don't act just like us. And so, just a general statement, we do. We judge anyone who just doesn't act just like us. Mm-hmm. And that's a barrier. We put a barrier up to community. So you have to and the older sometimes the church is, the higher that wall is of entry, where now I have to subscribe to totally this established confession and this theology that I don't understand, that I'm in one class for 3 hours to try to understand, and I have to agree to this confession in order to be a part of this community. That's a huge barrier for many, many people. When Jesus was all along removing those barriers, saying, wait a minute, and picking people up literally off the ground and talking to the other. So the church is its own demon sometimes because of judgment, and we create these walls and entry points. And so how do we remove the barriers of community? And that's through acceptance, through acknowledgement, through affirmation, through welcoming, gratitude towards others, that they're human beings, and also hospitality. So we reach out to others to bring them into community, just being hospitable first. What I really found interesting in the Scott Erickson live performance is Scott Erickson in and of himself is pretty much what I can tell is just a Christian guy who's a painter. And he paints beautiful pictures like Stations of the Street. You can go to scotterickson.com or scottthepainter.com or whatever. Just look him up online and you can find his stuff. Beautiful stuff. And he does it in a very abstract way, in a very, very different way. And of course, his live performance is very different. And so it's very audience participation. He has passed out these questions beforehand to certain people, and they're supposed to answer the question during the live performance. And so he'll call the number, and he's like, and number one said, and then you answer the question. What I learned that night is, here I am in a bar, right? It's a theater, but it's a bar. And in this live performance with, I don't know how many people were there, Jake? Couple hundred? Maybe a couple hundred. Maybe 100 people down on the floor and 100 people up in the balcony. Maybe. Just a kind of a small crowd for what this was. And everyone's just there and hanging out and eating really bad pizza and hot dogs and beer and just kind of just joining in, listening to literally a gospel message. I mean, by the end, this guy is literally sharing a Christ-centered message, way different than you would expect, way from different abstract angles that you wouldn't even guess were coming. And the questions that were answered showed me that every single walk of life that could afford a ticket. So let's word it that way. That could afford a ticket. So let's say every walk of life in the middle class that you could imagine expressed that they were there through these questions. The reason why I say that is because the church is known for who is our target market: young middle class families, right? That only act a certain and express themselves a certain way. So even in our notorious versions of target market, I sound like I'm some corporate guy, but even in our attitude towards target market, when it comes to who are we going to capture in the church and evangelize into the church, we've excluded even most of that target market. If you just look at the church as a corporate entity, we've excluded most of the customers. So it's really our own demons through judgment that have done that. We just judge people's lives to the point we throw up huge barriers. So how do you release those barriers? Through affirmation, acceptance, and welcoming, being hospitable towards others. And that's where we're going into. Let's quickly, because I talked too long there. Let's quickly go into followers of tradition. Mark 7. Should I read this one?
Go
I can
for it.
read this one.
Why not?
Okay. Why not? That's 23 verses. Wow, I picked like the longest one. The Pharisees and some legal experts from Jerusalem gathered around Jesus. They saw some of his disciples eating food with unclean hands. They were eating without first ritually purifying their hands through washing. The Pharisees and all the Jews don't eat without first washing their hands carefully. This is a way of observing the rules handed down by the elders. Upon returning from the marketplace, they don't eat without first immersing themselves. They observe many other rules that have been handed down, such as the washing of cups, jugs, pans, and sleeping mats. Seems reasonable. So the Pharisees and legal, it doesn't say that in the text. So the Pharisees and legal experts asked Jesus, why are your disciples not living according to the rules handed down by the elders, but instead eat food with ritually unclean hands? He replied, Isaiah really knew what he was talking about when he prophesied about you hypocrites. He wrote, this people honors me with their lips, but their hearts are far away from me. Their worship of me is empty, since they teach instruction that are human words. You ignore God's commandment while holding on to rules created by humans and handed down to you. Jesus continued, clearly you are experts at rejecting God's commandments in order to establish these rules. Moses said, honor your father and your mother, and the person who speaks against the father or mother will certainly be put to death. But you say, if you tell your father or mother everything I'm expected to contribute to you is Corban, that is a gift I'm giving to God, then you are no longer required to care for your father and mother. In this way, you do away with God's word in favor of the rules handed down to you, which you pass on to others. And you do a lot of other things just like that. Then Jesus called the crowd again and said, listen to me, all of you, and understand. Nothing outside of a person can enter and contaminate a person in God's sight. Rather, the things that come out of a person contaminate the person. Can I just read that again? I just want to sit there. Listen to me, all of you, and understand. Nothing outside of a person can enter and contaminate a person in God's sight. Rather, the things that come out of a person contaminate the person. After leaving the crowd, he entered a house where his disciples asked him about that riddle. He said to them, don't you understand either? Don't you know that nothing from the outside that enters a person has the power to contaminate? That's because it doesn't enter into the heart, but into the stomach, and it goes out into the sewer. It's just a dramatic pause. By saying this, Jesus declared that no food could contaminate a person in God's sight. It's what comes out of a person that contaminates someone in God's sight, he said. It's from the inside, from the human heart, that evil thoughts come. Sexual sins, theft, murder, adultery, greed, evil actions, deceit, unrestrained immorality, envy, insults, arrogance, and foolishness. All these evil things come from the inside and contaminate a person. It can contaminate a person in God's sight. Jesus left that place.
No, that's done. You're good.
Oh my God. Okay.
Spray, remind me what you said right before we started reading.
That when all of your needs are met, you don't need to depend on your community. And so I'm thinking about how drawing lines of clean and unclean are ways of determining who's in and who's out, and who you can rely on and who you don't have to rely on. And if you and your two friends or whatever are clean and everyone else is unclean, you don't have to invest in community.
That if you call people unclean, basically they're outside of the
Mm-hmm.
blessing of God, or we don't have to worry about them.
And
Correct.
if we're the Bible says we're ministers of reconciliation. And so
Only
in our actions of building walls and pushing people to the outside, we're actually contributing to the lack of reconciliation
definitely.
in so many deep ways.
What I find interesting about this text is how Mark has to describe what the Pharisees do and did
That
in the
is
very
interesting.
first. And
Yeah.
so, textually, if you look at it, either that was added much later
Yeah.
or it was written for a time period after the Pharisees, so after the temple destruction.
I've heard the defense that that's added in because the people were not Jews.
Okay.
I mean, it could be all true, right?
It's all true. Yeah. I mean,
Yeah.
why would it be in there if it was a very early writing and also if the readers were Jews?
Right. What's really interesting, though, is Romans, the Greek people, the Roman people, they weren't dirty people.
Say more.
Well, they had, they literally had like public baths. They had water, like they had bringing water in. So you think about the water systems that they had developed over a long period of time.
The baths and the
So
fountains and the
right.
aqueducts
So
and yeah.
right. So all of that is present, right? And so to say that this was actually just solely written for Greek people, I think that a Greek person would have understood not washing your hands before you eat.
Of course.
That wouldn't have had to be in like this huge explanation. Maybe it was to just show how ludicrous that is. To not just to be a part of your maybe common ritual, and you had to ritualize it and then exclude people for washing their hands. When my kids don't wash their hands before dinner, I say, hey, go wash your hands, right? I don't sit there and make some big theological treatise over my daughters or going to some special place outside of heaven because they don't wash their hands.
Fair.
I don't know. Just had that thought.
Yeah.
Romans were clean people. I mean, they wore white togas, so like
They had to be somewhat clean. Any more thoughts on this one? I'm not
oh
sure.
man, I think that there's a lot to it. It's a lot of the same of what we've talked about before, where it comes to putting so many what they call fences around the Torah, where you have the Torah and the Torah, the Word of God is meaningful, but then we start just building more and more legal rules and regulations, and they call that putting fences around the Torah. So eventually you have so many rules. Who knows the rules, right? So one of these that I've thought of over the years is you can't walk more than 1,000 paces on the Sabbath. They didn't necessarily have their
Pedometer out.
their odometers on their watches. I have this that tells me, hey, 10,000 paces today, good job, right? Well, on 999, take a seat. So they had this like rule, this fence around the Torah to keep you from not working on the Sabbath. To not break the Sabbath is don't walk more than 1,000 paces. Don't heal. Can't heal a sick person on the Sabbath. You have to just let them perish or survive till Monday, or survive till Sunday. I'm here. Then, so I
Which,
think
I mean, if you
that
look at
is a lot of it.
the whole system of the Pharisees, right? The Pharisaical system, they were created out of a fear and necessity to not be taken over again. And so if their entire national narrative is built on the premise that they were destroyed twice or three times because they didn't follow God's rules.
Yeah.
And so now you have people and occupied people now with the Roman occupation, where this is the third or fourth time that they don't want to break any more rules because they don't want to be scattered. And so they are doing their darndest to
You can say
damnedest to not be overtaken again. And so I think a little bit they're given this really awful rap of rule mongering. They're doing the best they can what was given to them. And I think that is also needs to be like seen as well in the text, that they really had viable arguments on why they were believing the way they are. And so people today as well, they have in their pharisaicalness, they have viable arguments for being the way that they are. But it's when it came to excluding people, that's when they got into trouble.
Yeah, so I'm going to bring up something here because I don't think it's too far-fetched what these people are dealing with. It directly relates to what we deal with today. Meaning that, there were times in the church that, the unclean were considered like, okay, the Calvinists are going to take us over. Right? And so we had to like teach this, micro version of theology to make sure that the Calvinists didn't take us over.
But that would have been awful.
Well, religious people are a pain in my butt anyway. So like I just look at, hey, let's talk about Calvinism. No, let's not. Let's just move on. And I think that so then it was the left behind people.
They were left behind in school.
You were left behind in school? Is that what you said?
Yeah.
So then it was the left behind people. All the apocalyptic people came out, then we had like these cards that would come in the mail, with Jesus on a horse and tanks, attacking whoever, next to Jesus with, Apache helicopters. They were the locust, like flying over. So, we had all these scare tactics or all these like micro theologies to make sure that some group wasn't going to take us over, because it's just a bunch of religious garbage just being thrown at each other. It's like taking, dog crap and throwing it at each other and losing the whole point of Christianity and losing the whole point of the love of Christ when we're sitting there. So I just love when somebody, some new person will come. It hasn't happened very often. It resonate less necessarily, but theology is really important to me. I'd like to sit down with you and have a cup of coffee. Talk theology.
There's the door.
I can tell you right now that our church is probably not the place for you, because what you want to do is you actually just want to tell me your theology and how possibly I'm wrong. That's usually how those conversations go, because I have not met very many people that theology is really important to them in the big picture of their lives. So I think theology is important, but I can sit down with you. So this is what I believe. What do you believe? Let's talk about it. Let's hash it out. Is there anything that we disagree with? And if we do, awesome. Let's talk about it. Right? I'm not sitting there like making a judgment call on your life because you believe something different than I do, or maybe I am. I don't know, and I don't tell you. I don't know. But what I think is that we throw theology at each other, and we micro our theology at each other, and we lose the whole heart of the message. And I think that's what this whole passage is about: is you give lip service to God, and you talk about the trappings of the table, whether there's bacon with your eggs. Basically, that's what that passage is about. Don't have bacon with your eggs. That's the Jews can't eat bacon, right? So they say things like that, but they lost the love of Christ in their hearts, the love of God in their hearts. Okay, so somebody sitting across from you eating bacon. Okay, can you still love them? Can you still care for them? That's like giving lip service to God and not love and not having it expressed from the heart.
If we read one more section, we can hopscotch over the top of the feeding of 4,000.
Good, let's just read it. We don't even have to comment.
One more, Rob. 24. I think it's in there somewhere. There we go.
There it is.
You just let that
read
play.
It for us.
Oh, go ahead, Trey.
Jesus left that place and went into the region of Tyre. He didn't want anyone to know that he had entered a house, but he couldn't hide. In fact, a woman whose young daughter was possessed by an unclean spirit heard about him right away. She came and fell at his feet. The woman was Greek, Syrophoenician by birth. She begged Jesus to throw the demon out of her daughter. He responded, "The children have to be fed first. It isn't right to take the children's bread and toss it to the dogs." But she answered, "Lord, even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs." "Good answer," he said. "Go on home. The demon has already left your daughter." When she returned to her house, she found the child lying on the bed and the demon gone.
You read that because it had all the hard words. Throw that back up there, Rob. Let's make a few comments and then we have to shut it down for the night. But this is an important one. So what's here in the center?
The hardship with this passage is the idea of calling people outside of the Jewish culture dogs. And that's what actually they would call them, as dogs. And so that's what Jesus is really responding to. And to have a woman in the culture stand up for herself in front of a powerful Jewish man, I think, is the complete scene of this text. That not only is she Greek, Syrophoenician, not only is she just considered a dog by the Jews at the time, but she is a woman and she stands up and gives a good answer. But also, the healing wasn't contingent upon her answer. The demon is already left because she had the faith to go there and to kneel down, to fall. Those are my thoughts.
Yeah.
Well, if you continue to leave that up there, Jesus left that place and went into this region. That, number one, that region is like off limits. And so he's crossing this boundary that, well, I guess it wasn't totally off limits because both groups lived there, didn't they?
What were you going to say, Sheree?
I have two thoughts. One is that we just read a passage about what makes a person unclean, right? So it stood out to me that the daughter is possessed by an unclean spirit. So I think the text has already given us a way to think about that and connecting those two stories together. The other thing I was thinking about, one of my college professors taught a class called Humor in the Bible. And with this passage, suggested like if we view the conversation as banter, it changes the whole tone.
Okay.
And I kind of like a Jesus that banters.
Oh, totally.
But also, like, in that whole thing, a woman that is strong enough to banter back with a man
Right.
Right.
in the
Right.
time period. I mean, that's even bigger of than just saying that she's just talking back. She's actually being sardonic back.
Right.
Go ahead and throw that back up there, Rob. I'm looking at this and wondering, would the church at Rome exist without this passage?
Would the church at Rome exist without this passage? Say more.
Well, he's crossing a boundary, and he's there talking to Gentiles.
Yes.
So this shows me something, that Jesus is willing to definitely cross over into a territory that the message then goes beyond the Jews.
Well, we already saw, like, this is the second time that I'm remembering. The first was Legion,
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
and this is at least the second time, if not more.
Okay, so there's more stories. So if you take those stories and put them together, is my little theory there correct? If those stories didn't happen in a gospel,
Yeah.
so connect those stories together, I don't know if the church at Rome would really exist.
The church outside of
Outside of, yeah,
Israel.
because it's Jesus doing these actions.
Mm-hmm.
And if you think about the writings that maybe they focused on in the first, second century of the church, it would have been these writings.
Yeah. I mean, it could even be because this was written after Paul, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And so
Could
the
have been
idea
influenced.
it could have been influenced. I'm not sure where else Syrophoenician comes up in the New Testament,
Right.
but I think we have lots of instances where Jesus was stepping outside of cultural boundaries.
Mm-hmm.
There's another text that say, I came only for the Jews, and I forget where that's at. It kind of contradicts everything around everywhere, and so you really need to take a hard look at that passage. The idea is that Jews first and then the Gentiles, the dogs in this scenario. But you have, I know of, like, Jesus specifically with Legion was thrown out of a Gentile man. The Syrophoenician woman, the Roman ruler's pederast boy servant,
Right.
was healed, raised from the dead. I'm trying to think of other non-Jewish healings that Jesus had. I can't think of many more besides that.
Well, you can see that this is to talk about more about what Sharia was saying. You can see that this passage definitely is a banter. Number one, right before this, it's being talked about that what comes out of your heart is what matters. What comes out of you, not what you put inside. What comes out of you matters. So he couldn't possibly have been dissing on this woman and calling her a dog. That wasn't culturally connected to something that he was trying to dismantle. And in her answer, he says, Lord, even the dogs, in her answer, under the table eat the children's crumbs. good answer, go on home, the demon has left your daughter. So it goes back to what Sheree is saying, banter, but it also goes back to the begging. She begged Jesus to throw the demon out of her daughter. So obviously she had some kind of glimpse of hope or confidence that Jesus was who he said he was going to be.
Yeah.
Or is. And basically, like, grants the request.
Any more thoughts, Trey? You got anything?
Nope.
That's a hard passage to leave on, but I think, Rob, you can pull that down. I think we're going to stop there because then we get to skip over the feeding of the 4,000 next week, right? And go right into that next story. So that's exciting. Thanks for suggesting that, Jake. Well, with that, thanks everybody for joining us. And you can tune in next week, same time, same place. Again, if you want to connect in, make some comments on social media, go to our Give site, give financially, however you want to. Just participate with us in some way. All right, with that, good night, everybody. Thanks for joining us.